Here's the question nobody is asking. When a man who built his entire reputation on the deal, on leverage, on walking away from the table just long enough to make the other side flinch, when that man suddenly reaches across that same table and offers you peace, what's the first thing you should ask yourself? Not is this real? That's the wrong question. That's the question a tourist asks. That's the question someone asks when they're reading headlines instead of reading power. The question you need to ask, the only question that matters when you're trying to understand how the world actually works, is this: what does he get from stopping now that he cannot get from continuing? Because in geopolitics, a ceasefire is never an ending. A ceasefire is a door, and the only thing that determines whether that door leads somewhere safe or leads you deeper into a room you can't get out of is understanding what the man holding it open actually wants on the other side. We are living inside one of the most consequential pauses in modern history, and almost nobody is reading it correctly. Let's go back to April 7th, 2026. 40 days. 40 days of the United States and Israel hammering Iranian nuclear facilities, infrastructure, oil terminals, radar installations. 40 days of the world watching oil prices climb in ways that made economists nervous and ordinary people furious at the gas pump. 40 days of global shipping routes convulsing, of insurance premiums on cargo ships spiking to surreal levels, of the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow, irreplaceable throat through which roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day, trembling under the shadow of Iranian missiles. And then, after Trump had gone on record threatening that, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight, a ceasefire was announced. Just like that, Pakistan brokered it. Iran allowed the strait to reopen. The markets erupted in relief. Wall Street hit record highs within 48 hours. The White House declared it a strategic victory. And then the spokespeople started talking. And if you were paying close attention, not to the celebration, but to the specific words they chose, something strange started to emerge. Stephen Miller, Trump's deputy chief of staff, went on television and said, with the calm confidence of a man who doesn't realize he's being a little too honest, that Trump had played the checkmate move. J.D. Vance told reporters that Trump doesn't want a small deal, he wants the grand bargain. And Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, standing at the White House podium in front of the cameras, announced that if negotiations broke down, the United States was fully prepared to launch what he called the financial equivalent of a bombing campaign. Read that back slowly. The financial equivalent of a bombing campaign. They are not describing a peace agreement. They are describing a siege with a polite, well-lit pause built into the middle of it. The bombs have stopped. The economic machinery is tightening its grip, and Iran is being asked to negotiate while a gun that has simply been moved from the temple to the throat is still very much present. This is not diplomacy in the traditional sense. This is something older, something that runs underneath the vocabulary of press conferences and UN resolutions. It has a name, actually. It's called the false peace trap. And to understand why it works, why it almost always works eventually on exhausted adversaries who have been sold on the idea that any pause is progress, you have to stop watching the present and start reading history. Think about the Boer War. The British Empire, at the height of its power, could not defeat the Boers in open battle. The guerrilla insurgency was bleeding them. British soldiers were dying in the veldt for a cause the public back home was growing tired of. So, the British offered something that looked like relief. A ceasefire, terms of negotiation, discussions of autonomy, language of mutual respect. And while those talks were underway, while the Boers were sitting across tables discussing their future in carefully formal language, the British were building the concentration camps. By the time the Boers understood the nature of the peace they had accepted, they were already inside a system that had been specifically engineered to destroy their capacity to ever resist again. The ceasefire wasn't the end of the strategy. The ceasefire was the strategy. Or think about Rome. If you want to understand how dominant powers actually think about peace, not the peace they advertise, but the peace they design, you need to study the Romans. When Rome offered a client kingdom a peace treaty, that treaty almost always came with provisions. Disarmament clauses, economic dependencies, the quiet removal of whatever conditions had made resistance possible in the first place. The peace looked from the outside like recognition. like respect, like Rome acknowledging that you were worth talking to rather than simply crushing. But functionally, what it did was digest you. Rome didn't need to conquer you twice. It just needed you to agree willingly and in writing to the terms of the first time. Now hold that image in your mind and look at what America is asking Iran to agree to right now. Halt all uranium enrichment. Not reduce it, not cap it, not place it under expanded monitoring. Halt it entirely. Accept a blockade of its ports as a continuing condition of the negotiations themselves. Allow the Strait of Hormuz to remain open, which Iran has framed as a gift, a gesture of good faith, while the United States runs what it calls a mine-clearing operation in those same waters. An operation that, as a functional matter, installs a permanent U.S. Navy operational presence in the most strategically sensitive waterway on the planet. And do all of this while Ayatollah Khamenei, who was not directly involved in the ceasefire negotiations at all, remains technically the supreme leader of Iran, which means the man who controls Iran's ideological infrastructure, its revolutionary guards, its theological legitimacy, has not actually agreed to any of this. He simply stopped shooting. And while he stopped shooting, he went on state television and told his people that America had blinked first. Here's the part that the Western press doesn't seem to want to sit with long enough to understand its full implications. Khamenei is not entirely wrong. Iran launched 22 waves of missile strikes over those 40 days. They hit Israeli infrastructure in ways that Israel has been tellingly quiet about. The details of what was actually damaged have been kept carefully out of public view, which is itself a kind of answer. They struck Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a facility that houses thousands of American military personnel, and those strikes caused no American casualties. Now think about that for a second. Either Iran was exercising extraordinary restraint, choosing deliberately and with precision to strike a base housing American forces without killing Americans, because killing Americans would change the entire nature of the conflict. Or Iran was demonstrating a level of precision targeting that should concern American military planners quite deeply. Neither interpretation is particularly reassuring if you're sitting in the Pentagon. And then, and this is the sequence that matters more than any satellite image of a bombed facility, Washington reached out first. Not Tehran, Washington. Through Qatari intermediaries, Washington signaled interest in stopping. Washington asked Pakistan to take on the mediating role. Washington was the first government to use the word ceasefire in an official communication. In the logic of Middle Eastern street politics, in the narrative grammar that every merchant in the Tehran bazaar and every university student in Mashhad instinctively understands because it's the same grammar that has governed the region for centuries, this sequence of events carries a meaning that no White House press briefing can scrub clean. The superpower called for the pause. The Islamic Republic kept firing until the superpower asked them to stop. That's the story. Not the craters in Fordow, not the rubble at Natanz, not the oil price charts. The story, in the only language that matters for the next 50 years of this region's history, is they shot at us for 40 days and we didn't flinch first. This is what Iran's leadership has always understood about America, that America has never quite been able to understand about itself. America is extraordinarily capable of destroying things. There is no country on earth that can project military force the way the United States can. That capacity is real, it's overwhelming, and Iran learned during those 40 days exactly how real it is. But America cannot sustain the political cost of destruction over time. The American public, and this isn't a criticism, it's just a structural reality of democratic governance, operates on a different clock than empires do. The news cycle is measured in hours. Political careers are measured against election cycles that come around every 2 or 4 years. Public attention, even for the most dramatic events, has a half-life. And eventually, every president needs an exit ramp, needs a moment to stand in front of cameras and say, "We accomplished what we set out to accomplish." Iran understands this. It has arguably understood it since 1979. What the Ayatollahs grasped early and have never forgotten is that whoever controls the timing and the terms of that exit ramp controls the outcome of the conflict, regardless of the casualty count on either side. So Iran let itself be bombed for 40 days. Let's be clear about what that decision actually represents. This is not incompetence. This is not weakness. This is a civilization that fought Saddam Hussein's forces for 8 years. 8 years, losing hundreds of thousands of people, watching its cities bombed, its economy strangled, chemical weapons used against its soldiers, and it never, not once, accepted terms of surrender. This is a civilization that has watched every major American military intervention in its neighborhood over the last 25 years. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya collapse into chaos that, almost without exception, ultimately expanded Iranian regional influence. Iran doesn't think in quarters. It doesn't think in election cycles. It thinks in centuries. And in the logic of centuries, 40 days of bombing followed by a superpower asking for a ceasefire is not a defeat. It's data. Very expensive, very painful data, but data nonetheless. The data says, America will hurt you badly. America will not finish you. America will make maximalist demands in the opening position, but America will eventually need a story it can bring home and sell as a victory. And if you can survive long enough, if you can absorb enough punishment to reach the moment when America needs that story, you can have a significant influence over what the story says. Now, Trump is offering what J.D. Vance called the grand bargain. No nuclear weapons in exchange for Iran's economic resurrection, full sanctions relief, reconstruction assistance, integration into international financial systems, a future where Iranian oil flows freely onto global markets and Iranian businesses can operate without the crushing weight of secondary sanctions choking off every transaction. It sounds honestly like a compelling offer. It sounds like something a serious statesman would make. It sounds like the kind of bold, unconventional move that breaks decades of failed policy and opens a genuinely new chapter. But here's what the grand bargain actually requires Iran to give up. The nuclear program isn't just about nuclear weapons. This is the subtlety that gets lost when the conversation gets reduced to headlines about enrichment percentages. The nuclear program is about the credible possibility of nuclear weapons. And that credible possibility is the only card in Iran's hand that cannot ultimately be bombed away. Because knowledge isn't infrastructure. You can bomb a centrifuge facility. You can turn a mountain into rubble. You cannot bomb the engineers who designed the centrifuges. You cannot bomb the institutional memory of a program that has been running in various forms for decades. You cannot bomb the knowledge that lives inside human beings who, if they survive, can rebuild. Khamenei said this with a kind of contemptuous precision. When Trump declared Iran's nuclear capability destroyed, the supreme leader's public response was 4 words. Let him keep imagining. 4 words. And inside those 4 words is an entire strategic doctrine. You destroyed the buildings. The buildings were never the point. The point is what we know, and what we know cannot be unlearned from the sky. Now, if Iran accepts the grand bargain, if it formally surrenders its nuclear program in exchange for economic reconstruction and sanctions relief, what exactly has it traded? It has traded its ultimate deterrent for money, for market access, for integration into an international financial system that is ultimately controlled by the same country that just spent 40 days bombing it. And that country, or a future version of that country, under a future president with different priorities, can reimpose sanctions the moment Iranian behavior becomes inconvenient, can reactivate the economic siege at will, because the infrastructure of that siege, the secondary sanctions architecture, the banking restrictions, the oil export controls, doesn't disappear when a deal is signed. It goes into standby mode. The Islamic Republic has watched this movie before. They watched it with the JCPOA, the nuclear deal signed in 2015, which was canceled unilaterally in 2018. They watched their economy open up for 2 years, watched foreign investment begin to flow in, watched ordinary Iranians start to believe that the isolation might genuinely be ending, and then they watched it all reverse, overnight, because one election produced a president who disagreed with his predecessor. To accept the grand bargain is to accept permanent exposure to that sequence. It is to place Iran's economic survival, and therefore its political stability, and therefore the survival of its government, in the hands of American electoral politics. It is to transform from a difficult, costly adversary into a dependent. And the history of dependence in American foreign policy is not an encouraging read. There is a clock running that most of the commentary is ignoring. Every day that the ceasefire holds without a formal agreement, the United States is conducting its mine-clearing operation in the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, American naval assets are consolidating their presence in waters that Iran has historically treated as its strategic backyard. Every day, the sanctions architecture is being expanded and refined. Secondary sanctions are being threatened against China and the UAE, the two countries through which Iran has managed to keep some economic lifelines intact despite decades of primary sanctions. The ceasefire is giving America time to build a more precise economic siege, and it's giving Iran time to watch its economy bleed. Its infrastructure sits unrepaired, its oil exports remain choked, its people, exhausted from years of sanctions and now 40 days of bombardment, are not marching in the streets demanding that their government hold out for better terms. They are exhausted, and exhaustion is, historically, one of the most powerful forces in international negotiations. Inside Tehran, there is reportedly a genuine split between pragmatists who want any deal that ends the economic bleeding and hardliners who understand, correctly in my reading, that any deal on these specific terms represents the effective end of Iran as an independent strategic actor. The foreign minister has signaled that Iran might withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty entirely. Iranian officials have publicly talked about retaining what they called battlefield leverage for lasting strategic gain. These are not the words of a government that has processed defeat. These are the words of a government that is desperately trying to figure out how to negotiate with a counterpart who has decided that the only acceptable outcome is permanent Iranian strategic disarmament, dressed up in the vocabulary of economic partnership. What we are watching in real time is a masterclass in the deployment of overwhelming force, followed by the strategic performance of magnanimity. It is the oldest sequence in the grammar of empire. It's just been translated into 21st century language, complete with press conferences and Wall Street metrics and the soft lighting of diplomatic summits. But strip away the language and the sequence is ancient. The bombs establish the hierarchy. The ceasefire installs the terms. The negotiations ratify that hierarchy as a permanent condition and give it a legal framework and a handshake photo that both sides can display to their domestic audiences. The genius of it, and it is, in a cold and unsettling way, genuine strategic genius, is that the target of this sequence has to make a nearly impossible choice. If they refuse the deal, they face the continuation of the siege. The economic bleeding doesn't stop. The pressure doesn't relent. Their people's suffering extends indefinitely into a future with no visible exit. If they accept the deal, they gain economic relief in the near term while surrendering the strategic capacity that would allow them to resist the next time this same logic is applied to them. They trade present suffering for permanent vulnerability. The false peace trap works not because the target is stupid, but because the target is human. Because there is a difference between understanding intellectually that a peace is a trap and being able to resist the pull of it when your economy is contracting, your infrastructure is rubble, and your people are exhausted and scared. Clarity and exhaustion are fighting each other inside every decision maker in Tehran right now. And whoever wins that internal struggle will determine not just what happens to Iran, but what template gets applied to the next adversary that tries to resist American strategic management. Here is why the stakes are so much larger than Iran. Whatever works here will be remembered. It will be studied. It will be taught in the staff colleges of rival powers and the foreign ministries of smaller countries, watching nervously to see how this ends. The playbook being written in real time across these negotiations is not primarily about uranium. It's about the answer to a question that every mid-sized power with ambitions toward strategic independence is asking right now. Is there a way to resist and survive? If Iran eventually capitulates, if exhaustion overcomes clarity, and if the Islamic Republic accepts terms that functionally subordinate its strategic choices to American approval, the lesson encoded in that outcome is devastating for every government on earth that has been hoping the answer to that question is yes. It says you can endure the bombs, but you cannot endure the peace that follows. The peace is the instrument of final defeat. And knowing that doesn't protect you from it, because knowing it doesn't make your people less hungry, your infrastructure less destroyed, your economy less strangled. If Iran refuses, if it walks away from the grand bargain, withdraws from the non-proliferation treaty, and begins an open sprint toward a nuclear deterrent, the immediate consequences are catastrophic. But the long-term strategic logic is not irrational. A nuclear-armed Iran is, from Iran's perspective, an Iran that America has to factor into its calculations permanently, an Iran that paid an almost incomprehensible price to achieve a position that makes the next 40 days of bombardment infinitely less likely. Because the calculus of striking a nuclear-armed state is fundamentally different from the calculus of striking a state that might someday become one. This is the corner that 40 days of bombing has painted everyone into, not just Iran, everyone. I want to end with something that gets skipped over in nearly every analysis of this conflict, something that doesn't fit neatly into the framework of military assets and sanctions architecture and strategic deterrence theory. There are people inside these events. There are engineers in Isfahan who spent their careers building something, who watched it get bombed, and who are sitting in whatever shelter they have, deciding whether their knowledge is something they will deploy again. There are families in Tehran who have lived under sanctions their entire adult lives, who have watched their currency collapse and their savings evaporate and their children emigrate, who are being asked by the logic of grand geopolitics to be patient for a little while longer. There are soldiers and sailors and bureaucrats on both sides of this conflict who went to work one morning and ended up inside a historical event that textbooks will eventually name and analyze. And then there are the watchers. Every government in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, every government that is not a great power but has interests and ambitions and reasons to sometimes disagree with the countries that are, they are watching this. They are taking notes. They are drawing conclusions about what kind of world they live in and what choices are actually available to them, and whether the language of sovereignty and self-determination that fills the speeches at international summits corresponds to any reality on the ground. The world is not just watching a war pause. The world is watching a story being written about who gets to resist and at what cost, and whether resistance can ever be something other than a different road to the same destination. And the most consequential question in that story isn't asked in Washington or Tehran. It's asked quietly in the foreign ministries and presidential palaces of every country that is smaller than its ambitions, watching and wondering whether the lesson being written in real time applies to them. It does. It always does. The lesson never stays in the place where it was first taught. It travels. It spreads. It arrives eventually everywhere. And the silence after the missiles stop, the silence that peace fills, the silence that negotiations fill, the silence that deal terms and economic frameworks and carefully worded joint statements fill, that silence is where the real architecture of the next generation gets built, not in the bombing, in what comes after, in who controls the story that fills the silence. And right now, that is the only question that actually matters. Sonnet 4.6 Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double check responses, share.